So I want to welcome everybody today. I'm going to share my screen so we can continue on with our discussion of the user stories. Last time we met, we completed all the user stories that were from the cataloger perspective. So today we're going to start from the place where we're looking at user stories from the developer's perspective. So we did start a conversation with this first one, but I think that's probably the best place for us to pick up the discussion. Because we just started touching on it, and there was a couple of things that folks brought up that might be a question. So just to sort of clarify, because there's a lot of developers at each of the levels, people take on developer roles. But this particular set of developers are the ones who are developing applications that sit between the providers, the authority providers, and the catalogers who want to make use of the authority data. So I just want to sort of set that as the stage, that's the type of development activity that we're talking about under this particular section. So the primary goal here is we're going to go through each of these and try to flesh out the language and make sure that each of the user stories is an effective way of describing what it is that the developers want to have in place in order for them to be successful at creating these applications. So the first one is, as a developer, I want one field in the authoritative entity to be a human readable, meaningful representation of the entity that can be displayed to users to identify the entity for selection. So last time we did talk a little bit about the difference between an authoritative source and an identity management system. And the specific example that was given is ISNI, which does not provide a display label with what comes from their API at this point in time. And so the question that was on the table is, who is responsible for creating a meaningful label? I will say that as a developer of applications that use authoritative data, it's kind of a critical piece to have a human readable label. And it does not seem like I, as the developer, should be the one that determines what's the best meaningful label to provide, because we would like to, regardless of who's developing that application, we'd like to all use the same human readable label. So I guess I'd like to open this up for discussion.
So not really coming from a developer perspective here, but I think one thing I wanted to clarify is like I feel like wanting to use the same human readable label like sort of implies that there's one label that's, you know, if not necessarily authoritative, is preferred universally, which I feel like is a really hard task to determine. But I guess, is this use case asking for the correct label, or is it asking for a human readable label that isn't necessarily wrong, but, you know, like in the case of ISNI, like there are many names. Is it that you just need one to arbitrarily be chosen that won't be misleading, or that is not necessarily misleading? Or is it that you need some kind of criteria to be applied that, you know, so, I mean, I guess I'm not sure whether you need a label or the label. That seems to be what I'm confused about with this one.
So this is Kevin. Let me jump in and see if I can describe the scenario. Imagine you're looking at OCLC's VOF, and you have an agent or a person. They have many, I think they're just all under RDFS label. And the name itself is just, that's the only thing under RDFS label. So, you know, when a cataloger goes along and creates an authorized access point and a mark authority record for a name, it may possibly be just the last name followed by the first name, but there may be additional qualifying information that helps you distinguish that person or that individual, or that name, I should say, from another name. So where I'm going with this is, if you look at VOF's data, you would have just a list of names in a variety of different scripts. And we could make up a rule that just says, okay, take the RDFS label that happens to be in whatever script you want, and it'll give you the name. But it doesn't necessarily give you everything that you're going to want, that you need in order to distinguish that person from another individual. I don't know if I'm helping. Another example that we've come across are actually things like works. Like if you wanted to create a label that would allow a user to be able to look at one string and be able to identify the work that's under discussion, you actually need to take the contributors and add them to the titles in order to create that string. And we kind of do that on a bespoke basis in our systems, but we have no general rule about what makes a quote unquote proper label or a good human readable representation. So I'm going to stop now, but anyway, I don't know if that helps, but that's the use case from the developer side.
Yeah, this comes up in the, so Lynette, I think where QA addresses this is with the context decisions we make. So one thing is to provide a label, but then also we've made decisions, at least for a particular data set, at the entity level or entity type level. We've kind of done what you said, Kevin, where it's like, okay, for this type of thing, what is the most meaningful, like 7 properties or whatever? Or there's no number, but and then it leaves it to the application to figure out what to do with that. And so if an application decides to concatenate them into one field that's like a list of the label and qualifiers, sure, or they can sort of indent or however it is that they want to address display, they can do that. But it's not, QA isn't creating one field with one label that has all that information. It sort of has it as parsable JSON.
Stephen, I think what you're saying implies that the label doesn't have to go out of its way to be distinct because of the context data. So,
yep.
Yeah.
I would certainly say the label's not going to be unique because you could have many Will Smiths and each one could be different. And it is that additional context that helps you to disambiguate those. So, yes?
There's only one Will Smith. Sorry.
Okay. I should have picked a different example. So one of the things I would like to make an observation about is that if you go to the provider's site, most of them, if not all of them, have a mechanism for searching locally on their site. And they generally do include some kind of label that identifies it. And ISNI is definitely an example of that. So if I go to ISNI and I do a search, the results I get is sort of a table that includes some kind of label that is like a person's name, plus another column that has the ISNI identifier and other types of information. So somehow ISNI itself is choosing a label to display in their own search. And so I'm wondering, how do we take what ISNI would do for their own search and make that available to developers so that they can do the same thing in the results that they display to their users?
I was wondering if it's possible, this is Hetty from ISNI, if it's possible to display the ontology, the structure of the data that you're presenting before you choose any meaningful representation as the preferred one. I've had a look at the AgriVoc ontology, and they seem to have a structure in which you can search, which tells you what type of information you have available and how it's hierarchically structured. So could you use that? So you start by making available the ontology and making that visible, and then the user, the consumer, decides how he wants to enter the data.
Just ask, are we making a distinction here between someone who is looking up an authority where they want an authorized access point or a standard label, and an identity management system where the label is not expected to be standardized.
I didn't quite catch that.
To me,
So I went in real quick just for the notes, Nancy. I didn't quite catch all that because you said a distinction between authority management system where the data may not be standardized and.
Well, no, I think.
Go ahead, Stephen. My audio is in and out. I'm gonna try a different audio.
So I'll try to say almost as close as I can to what Nancy said, but an authority management where there's an authorized access point, so like a unique string, and an identity management system where there's not a standardized label. So I would say even, and so that's what I think she said. And then I guess my reaction to that is that even with an authorized access point where we know within that space it's a unique label, it may not be for this use case where it says and enough information to select the proper thing. Even with a unique label, you don't always have enough information to actually select one from a list. If you have a bunch of Michael Jacksons, there is only one. But maybe you want to, or you don't know when that one was born, and there's others pretending to be Michael Jackson, and so, with different death dates, birth dates, etc.
Yeah, that's what I was getting. Thank you, Stephen.
Your audio is cleared up too, Nancy. By the way, feel free to edit the notes as well, because I still am not sure that I captured that quite the way you were expressing it. I will point out that lower down, we have something about extended context. Additional information about entities to help improve selection. So I would say that this part up here, I think serves two purposes. One is to sort of encapsulate in a single label sort of the essence of the particular thing that you're trying to select. The other would be something that could be displayed to users within an application that they could immediately know what they had selected, as opposed to like a code that may not be as clear. And then the additional information down here would be something that would be like, and we have all this other stuff that would help you disambiguate what you're looking at. I don't know if someone else on the developer side wants to chime in and say what they see is sort of like the purpose of the human readable field.
I still have a problem with the human readable field, because you might be a Korean user, and to you, human readable is Korean, and so you have to determine somehow what human readable means to you.
I would add, as part of that, would we have which language information related to the label? I know this has been, we've talked about this before, where right now we just have English pretty much for QA, but there may be a use case to support other languages or other labels.
I need to look below and see if we have something in this section about language, because that feels like a separate a separate question to me.
But it does have does have a lot to do with the human readability, because, like, for instance, even the distinction between a forename and a surname is different for different languages. I understand that for Chinese, you have middle names representing your generation. In Korean, you really shouldn't try to look up a surname because there are only like 250 or so, and that basically is no entry to your system. So you need to know how to interpret the human readable form of your entity. That's why it's so difficult to choose from the onset which is the best way to represent your entity, your authority record or your identity record. That's why we don't, for ISNI, we have all these variants.
Yeah, so I think much like last time, we broke the language into two parts because there's two aspects to it. One is I speak Korean, I want to see it in Korean. And the other is I know the thing I'm looking for is in Korean. And so I want to do the search in a way that would allow me to find that Korean label. But there's also the piece of being able to search in my native language, which might require certain changes to the way I do searching. Languages, I have to say from last time, languages is particularly challenging because there's subtleties about how it works.
I think, and maybe this is a dumb question, I think I'm having a hard time picking apart whether these are developer use cases or if these are just the cataloger use cases just sort of slightly restated. Like what's the distinguish, like I want to be able to display the human readable label in the end user's native language. Like what's the distinguishing thing here that makes this a developer use case?
So the answer is both. So it's definitely a cataloger use case in the sense that the cataloger needs to see it. From the developer side, we need to present a label to that cataloger, and the developer, if it just hits a service and gets a bunch of data out of it, we don't know necessarily which label that should be.
So this is about like the data that helps you distinguish between those things and not about the end user.
Correct.
Thanks.
Maybe what's the most important point for the developer is that the developer should offer to the cataloger the proper choices that he can use for different scenarios, for different languages, or whatever choice there is to make.
So to me, this is sort of blurring between actual developer use cases and maybe user interface. Certainly, you know, we want to support different user interfaces, but allowing a user to select different languages seems to me sort of more user interface-ish than developer-ish.
Yeah, there certainly is a blurring, I think, between some of the use cases we had as cataloger for the catalogers and the how they get sort of passed through to the developers, because it does strike me that the question at the cataloger level is that I want to be able to do things in another language. The question at the developer level is, how do I allow the user to do things with different languages? So, and you know, you sort of bring up the point that there's kind of two levels of developers as well. There's sort of the top layer of user interface that is very user centric, and then there's the lower level. I need to be able to get data out of the authority that I can pass through. And I didn't make that distinction when I was putting these together, of to the user facing part of an application versus the data oriented part of the application. So
Can I ask an API question? Because I'm woefully ignorant. Is it possible to have some kind of a toggle on an API? So I guess I'm wondering, what is the expectation that these APIs, will they just run under the hood, or will it be something where the user can kind of drop in the pieces that it wants, that he, she wants to get, so that the user, and I guess I'm wondering if the user has some influence over the API request, can the user, part of that influence be language? Does that solve from an API perspective? Does that kind of resolve that issue of language, where from the API perspective, you're just making it available to the user to say, I want the results returned in X language?
So I will say that right now, questioning authority has a language parameter on it, and you can pass in and say, you can pass in what language it is you want to use. So I could pass in language equals French. The challenge is that right now, the various authorities interpret that differently. So for some, if you say, I want to work with French, they expect you to type in French, and they expect you to see results in French. And so it's very much along the lines of the sort of browser experience, where people can set their preferred language, and then as much as possible, websites will always present in that language. And then others interpret it as that you want to search data in that language, but then the data is not actually stored in a lot of different languages, so it comes back in whatever form that particular record comes back in. And some don't do language at all. So I would say there's not a consistent interpretation of what it means to specify a language.
So from a best practices perspective, this is something that you would want to give feedback to the providers, the data providers, for some consistency?
I do, and I'm wondering if I'm just thinking here. So language to me, just from our last conversation last time and from the conversation we're having today, I'm wondering if that is something that we should have like a focused topic on later, and see if we can move through the rest of the use cases, and then we could set aside a particular meeting just to talk about language, because every time we talk about it, it gets more and more complex. And that's not a bad thing, that's just the way it is. But I would like, I just feel like maybe we could focus on it more directly and think about what kind of feedback would we give to authority providers to sort of say, this is kind of a best practice way to deal with language. Although the question I would ask is, for all authority providers, would you expect language to be handled the same way? Are there things that are unique about the data that might mean for some authorities we handle it one way and for another authority we handle it a different way?
I think it sounds like a good idea to handle language on its own and move forward, Lynette. That makes sense.
Okay. So with the caveat, and I'm going to kind of leave this one open because there seems to be a large caveat with this one around language and how that interacts with this human readable, meaningful representation. So we'll kind of revisit that one too when we do the language. I'm just going to add one more quick note here before we move on. Okay. So the next one would be, as a developer, I want to receive a permanent URI for each entity to uniquely identify the entity.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to complicate this.
Nice and easy. Good. I like those kind. As a developer, I want to provide a widget that enables a cataloger to select an entity from authoritative source using left-anchored autocomplete. Does that one also just sound good as is?
Well, I would say it's nice to have, and we do that for ourselves, but I don't think it's a requirement. It's a good thing.
Sure.
Right, and not all data is going to be set up to do left anchor. The way that labels are set up may or may not support that.
And I'm not sure it would be like a separate widget either. I mean, what we're thinking about in Sinopia would just be part of the lookup, and it would vary depending on the authority.
The one comment I wanted to make is I'm not sure if widget is the best word here, one. And two, going back to what Jeremy was saying earlier, that, you know, are we risking conflating a UI concept with an API parameter?
I guess I'm wondering what we're asking for from the API. Are we asking for names in indirect order, or are we asking for parsing names into surname and personal name in order to facilitate left anchored? This is the technical feasibility that seems to vary across different platforms. I'm thinking here of like how in Wikidata everything's in direct order, except that you can actually parse names out into other fields that enable inversion, but it doesn't always happen. Whereas, you know, in LC it's the default and you're not going to do anything else. So I guess I'm not clear whether we're asking for some kind of functionality in the API, or just something in the data, or if we're just asking for the API to tell us what it's giving us and how to use it. And again, I'm not a developer. I'm trying to figure out what we're asking for.
Sure. So from my perspective, if I'm querying an API, so that I'll note that the next line is about keyword search. So I would like to be able to pass to the authority provider saying, I'm doing this search and I would like to get the results back left anchored, so that it is an exact match of our human readable label that we haven't completely defined yet. And that's how things will come back. And the other way is that I've got a couple of pieces of a person's name and I'm going to type them in any order. So maybe in the actual system, it's Twain, comma, Mark with their birth and death date, but I'm just going to put in 2 words, Mark and Twain, and then things are just going to come back in a rank order of what was seen as the best set of matches. So the left anchored would be, these are going to be exact matches starting from the left. And in order to do that, I need to be able to pass something to the authority provider to tell them that's how I want the data back. So I'm not doing a keyword search. I want to see a left anchored exact match kind of search. And those are 2 different ways of searching through the authority.
Yeah, so it seems like there might be a class of API call that is just data dependent. This being one of them. And then also language we've already established, but then also maybe the preferred label.
Sorry, my son just stepped in and I had to tell him I'm on a call. So I'm finding it a little bit more challenging today, I think, to parse these down into an individual statement. There seems to be a lot of questions about how these would actually be stated and the distinction between the UI level and the API level. So there was
maybe I think I'm repeating in a way what I said before, but the only way to resolve the differences maybe between the UI and the API level is to state a number of preferred options that we want linked data to support in the UI, and passing them on to the API to ask whether they're supported. The answer may be no, or the answer may be yes. And then the API can react according to the wishes of the UI. Is that a possibility? So you always ask what the provider can provide, is able to provide, and then trying to use it as it can.
Yeah, so I wonder if there is like a 2-part thing to say, as a UI developer, I want a widget that enables catalogers to do the left autocomplete. And then as
I want to be able to ask whether the API has a left anchored autocomplete. And if the API says, no, I don't have it, then it's no use trying to put it in the user interface.
I think if you take as an example our SRU service, if you go to the SRU and you type in explain, it goes and gives you an XML document that tells you all of the supported indexes and types of things. And those indexes may actually just be a path in the API. Like for example, at ID, if you say /label, then you're going to do a keyword search with some sorting and relevance. And if you do /suggest, you're going to get a left anchor.
Do we really need that? Do we need the ability to introspect a authority? Like, I mean, it's cool, but it certainly, is that really I mean, of all the things we need, is that really significant?
The explain page?
I mean, just in general, the need to be able to, I mean, you know, what this is saying, you know, what that requirement is being able to introspect the capabilities of the provider. And, you know, for example, Sinopia, we take a totally different approach, which is we just have a configuration file which specifies what we expect the capabilities of, you know, of a authority to be, and that works just fine. Like, I'm not too sure we would want to incur the overhead of introspecting like the capabilities of an authority. I mean, does anyone do that for SRU, you know, at the SRU? It's available, but does anyone use it?
I have never used it.
Yeah.
But that's because you know how to use it.
I figure out exactly what I want. Well, no. I will use it as a human in order to figure something out. But once I use it as a human, how do I say this more clearly? I have never attempted to programmatically make use of the SRU explain document. I identify what I want, and then I code it into that.
Right, but you're only doing one LC SRU. You may not even be using SRU for the name authority file or the subject file. Each of those has different indexes that are supported, and you can't just start stabbing away and saying, oh, I think bath.lccn works here. Oh, it's not called bath.lccn. What's it called? If you go to the explain page, you see exactly what the LCCN index is called. Yeah, I don't see this as, I think this is kind of a trivial thing to say these are the indexes I support. And it's a way for you to not have to query the API to say, what are you, what languages do you have, what scripts do you support, in that sort of thing. It's all just stated up front.
So as a developer, I just much rather have it documented. That's my requirement, is that it be documented. That is programmatically documented and that I can access that is, I've never had a scenario in which that has been something I've taken advantage of.
Okay, well, I think we're talking past each other because the explain page is the documentation.
Sure, but my requirement is documentation. I'm not, if it's the explain page, that's fine, but my requirement is not that the documentation be programmatic. It's that there be documentation. It could be provided.
I agree that it sounds attractive to have programmatic documentation, which a program can access, especially because you don't want to have a user end up with 0 results, for instance, because he's using the wrong.
So is it just
search key.
Is it just that you don't want it to be an XML? You want it to be an HTML?
No, it's, I don't particularly care. I just want there to be documentation. That's my, as a developer, that is my requirement. However it is delivered, that documentation is delivered, I don't care. However, I'm not raising the bar any higher than that to say it needs to be XML or it needs to be JSON or it needs to be anything. I'm just saying my bar is documentation.
Okay,
And
that
so
sounds good.
let's, you know, if we're going to write a specification, we want the bar to be as low as the lowest possible bar to meet our requirements. So that's what I'm suggesting.
So I would say as well that we can actually put in multiple user stories here, one of which is I want to have documentation describing the capabilities of the authority and how I access it. The other could be that I want to have something like the SRU that allows me to programmatically make those same determinations. But then when we do the evaluation that says what's required and what would be nice to have, we could make the distinction there. And so then when we get down to the end of actually writing what we feel are the best practices, we're going to be looking at those things that says, this is required. And we're going to put that up front. And then the nice to have section that says, here are some other features you might include in your API, but by no means is it required. You could have something in there that says programmatic ability to query the authority to determine whether or not it can do something like left anchored.
That makes sense.
I think I'm gonna have to come back, listen to the audio when we're all done and reorganize these notes because there's a lot of information going past and I'm not sure I'm capturing everything. So I will take a second pass at some of these to make sure I've got it right when we're done. Because I want to split some of these into just separate rows as well so they can be analyzed that way. But I do have that I want to have documentation describing the capabilities of an authority and how to access it. Okay. And I will clean this up a little more afterward. Because like the basic things that I'm hearing for this particular section, so there is the desire to have a feature where you can do left anchored search. And then the other questions that stem from that seem to be more along the lines of, well, how do I know an authority allows me to do left anchored search? Because not all of them necessarily will. And so we had the programmatic request, and then we had just documentation, and then I'll do some kind of configuration for the UI side.
So Lynette, I apologize for being late and missing earlier part of this discussion, but as I look over these developer requirements, they strike me as they are cataloger requirements. The developer doesn't have any of these requirements. Catalogers have these requirements, which require the API to be a certain way. But like, I as a developer don't care whether there's a human readable field or any of that. That's a requirement of the cataloger that I need the API to have. Now,
So that's interesting because like I, as a developer in QA, I have to pass through information and I have particular fields that I'm looking for. So I want a URI and I want a human readable label. And then I want to be able to throw in extra information. And those get those get parsed out in the process of working with the data. It doesn't have to be that way. So I would be interested in hearing how you perceive, how would you do it without a human readable label? What would that look like to you as a developer in Sinopia? How would you put together a widget that allows you to display information to the end user so they could select things?
Okay, so you're right. I do accept that. Yes, as a developer, I have a requirement that there be a human readable label, that it have a URI, that there be a structured way of providing additional information. Whether the ability to support like different languages, that's a user requirement. That's not a developer requirement.
I could see that because from a developer's perspective, whatever I get, I want to be able to pass it through to the end user. I think the only part where it becomes, like for me, where it becomes a developer piece is that I need to have a parameter that allows me to pass additional information that's being requested from the user, whether that be language or some other, like how many items they want to see returned in the results or whatever. there's that aspect from the developer, but some of that is just passed through. So it's not something I'm going to interpret on my end. I'm just going to pass it through and I'm still going to get a set of results. So I wonder, how does that seem to you, like from a developer perspective, as opposed to like dealing with the language stuff?
Yeah, that makes it like a more, that makes more sense as a way to frame it.
So it's interesting because I think that you could also define the left anchored and keyword search similarly, because you could pass in a parameter that says, I want this particular search to be an exact match, or I want this particular search to be a left anchored, which perhaps that's interpreted the same. But you could pass it through as a parameter, and you as the developer really just want to be able to pass that through. I think from a UI perspective, you would have to know that an API supports left anchored, and so you need to provide the user with a way to select or deselect that. So there are some UI considerations, but as the API developer, you just really want to pass some of that information through to the authority.
My requirement is having a consistent way of specifying parameters. Now, what those parameters are driven by the user requirements, but that there has to be a consistent way of specifying them, and I don't have to do it differently for every authority, or, you know, is the developer requirement. It's the same with any of this, you know, with the how the data is, the structured data is returned. You know, it's all driven by, and this is in part our experience with Sinopia, is we don't want one-offs. Like anytime there's an if this that in the code, when we are handling an authority, that's entirely what we want to avoid. You know, and we learned that with like the Discogs code.
Okay, so I captured those two, the desire to specify parameters in the same way and having data returned in a consistent way. And that certainly is the role that QA is. The second one is and even the first one is sort of the role that QA is filling now, since the various authorities do not do that. All right, I think that what I'm going to do is we'll leave all this that's up at the top there as is. I'm aware that we only have like 3 minutes left, and given the level of questions we've been raising in this, I think that let's just stop here and we'll pick up at this one next time. And part of what I will do is I will listen back through the discussions that we had and see if I can synthesize this into a set of statements and user stories that I think are consistent with some of the discussion we've had, and maybe draw out a few of the discussion points, and we can kind of step back through and relook at them next time to see if the way I summarized it fits better with the actual expectations. So I appreciate everyone's participation today, and I look forward to the next time to see if we can tidy up the developer user stories.